Hello, welcome to the XY Chromies Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turn renewable energy engineers talk about science, veterans issues, engineering, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Richard Ellis. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm good, Pearson. It's good to talk to you this week.
Yeah, it's really good to talk to you. I had to slow it down because I'm trying to do the intro from memory now. So, that's happening. And clearly my memory just works way, way slower and chiller. So, anyways, today's episode is episode 20. We're going to be going into globalization part 3. Last time we ended at World War One, or kind of what started it, and we're going to be talking more about that and some other stuff around it. But first, before we get into that, we are going to cover a good news story like we like to do. In this world of doom and gloom news, it's nice to have a good news story here and there. And so that's how we like to kick it off. And I think, Richard, you have it for us today, right?
I sure do. So, as a little bit of a preamble, we were talking earlier this week about this really interesting new architecture at PDX at the International Airport in Portland. There's this new concourse that they've done all this wood architecture in, and there's what's called glulam beams, and there's all this acoustic structures into the building,
Yeah, Forbes
and
did an
it's
article on it. And my mom was
yeah,
visiting. She talked about it as well. So I got two
yep,
inputs right away. And yeah.
yeah. Evidently, it looks amazing and it sounds different and better to people who are in the concourse. And you know, I fancy myself a finished carpenter. I don't do it anymore, but I have my opinions about woodwork being integrated into commercial structures. So, I'm looking forward to um, the time when I'm finally put under enough pressure to actually get on an airplane again and travel, because I like to see it. But so wood kind of is making this interesting commercial and industrial entrance into the minds of people who are traveling out of the Portland airport, which is completely appropriate because up until the mid-century, everything in the Pacific Northwest was built out of the most abundant resource we had, timber.
Trees. It's on our
You
license
got it.
plate. Well, the
Mm-hmm.
the classic license plate of Oregon, I would say, at least that most people know us
Yeah,
for, that green fir tree that is front center, right in the middle.
that's
Very
right.
iconic symbol for us.
Douglas fir or red fir or what is it? Pseudosoiga, I think is the Latin term. um, so I'm mentioning the importance that wood has in the Pacific Northwest, kind of as a setup for my good news story, because despite its it the role that trees, timber, and lumber have in the Pacific Northwest economy and our culture, they're not even though they're a renewable resource according to some. It's not like we have the same forest here that we had at the beginning of the 20th century.
Hmm.
And some of the forests have been logged multiple times in that 100-year period because this timber will grow back in the span of about 60 years and you have a new marketable tree. But it's still a problematic and extractive resource commodity. Well, here's our good news story. Genetically engineered superwood absorbs more carbon and reduces emissions. This is from the Independent UK.
Okay.
Scientists have developed a new method of producing a superwood that stores more carbon and reduces emissions thanks to a groundbreaking genetic modification. The modified wood could also offer a more sustainable, durable, and cost effective alternative to traditional building materials. Researchers at the University of Maryland genetically modified poplar trees to lower their lignin content by 12.8%. Lignin is a key component that makes wood durable but complicates its processing.
Hmm. Okay.
So I'm already suspicious about the way this article is going because one, when we were talking earlier about our favorite tree of the Pacific Northwest, the red fir or Douglas fir, That is not a poplar tree. That's a very different tree.
Yeah.
Those are two entirely different things on the spectrum of
We
trees.
do grow quite a
Poplar
bit of
is,
poplars in Oregon, though. If you are going along the Columbia
oh
Highway
yeah,
84, the freeway, you will see poplar farms out there, like fields and fields.
Douglas fir is structural wood. Poplar is pulp.
Paper, wood, cardboard, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, so I mean,
Uh,
as to the article saying that it's reducing the structural integrity of it, it's like, well, okay, I guess we sacrifice that. No big deal because we're making pulp out of this. So,
yeah.
okay,
And in fact, if I remember my wood structure, yeah, the way that a Douglas fir tree grows during its growth period, there's sort of this the growth layer would look kind of spongy or expanded, and during the winter, um, the rest layer, the overwintering layer, is
it's
going to
thin and
look
hard.
kind of resiny and tightly packed together.
Yeah.
And so that's what gives a Douglas fir tree its the strength that we find in its lumber, the boards that we make out of it.
Well, it's got
And
really
all
good.
trees,
Yeah, I was gonna say it had. I mean, Doug fir is such a great wood for construction because it has just the right amount of structural integrity with that pliability as well. So there's enough
yeah,
give that allows it to be a really flexible building material and also have that structural integrity as well. I mean, yeah. So
totally.
you know,
So all trees have a ring structure in their the foundation of how they go from being a small tree to a big tree. But depending on the species and depending on the distinction between hardwoods and softwoods, a distinction I'm not going to go into in this forum, you get a different resulting strength factor for the different types of species of tree. And so poplar, if it's not going to be used as a rigid member or a strength member in construction, but it's going to be used in pulp, then the thing that makes Douglas fir strong, you don't want in poplar trees lignin. That's that
mhm.
tight layer that I was describing.
Yeah.
By reducing lignin, the wood can be directly used for high strength applications without chemical treatment. We're still talking about pulp wood. They're not clarifying this. Not only does this simplify the production process, but increases the wood's ability to store carbon, researchers said in a study published in the journal Matter on Monday. And I know our audience reads Matter every time it's published, and they're all hip to this.
Yeah.
Our method not only reduces chemical waste and energy consumption, but also improves the wood's carbon storage capabilities, which is crucial for mitigating climate change, said Professor Yiping Qi, one of the researchers. The genetically modified wood resists decay better, allowing it to store carbon for a longer time. This means less carbon is released into the atmosphere, contributing to a reduction in overall carbon emissions. Traditional wood, and here's where we're now finally getting to where we're understanding this as pulp wood. Traditional wood often is processed with chemicals. It tends to deteriorate quickly in its application, its products. Traditional wood needs significant energy and chemical inputs, which result in greenhouse gas emissions and chemical waste. The new approach eliminates these processes, making the production of high performance wood more environmentally friendly. All right, so I could go on. This article goes on and on, but what I wanted to share was what's interesting about this type of progress with gene modification in plants is that there's a there's a really nice wrestling match going on in uh, the conversation that we have about where our food is sourced from and whether or not a genetically modified organism is a healthy thing for us to eat. And there's a lot of shots fired on both sides.
I have a lot of
Arguments are made
surprises for
constantly that,
people about this, though. I mean, most of the fruits and vegetables we're eating already are super genetically modified. So, like, I didn't want to, I want to take away your thunder there, but oh my gosh, if people are worried about
yeah,
it,
it,
yeah,
it turns out what we're being showed is someone saying, "Oh, look, it's a genetically modified wheat. What are you going to do?" And then we go, "Oh, let's attack that." And then over here, it's all GMO, and we don't even notice it.
yeah. I mean,
So
yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
when we're talking about a GMO when it comes to trees, I would like to think that people could get behind this a little bit more because it's not at that hammer and iron intersection where if corporations are controlling our food, what does that mean for us and our survivability? But a an intellectual property on a tree, I wouldn't want to see that get out into the wild and just become the standard tree that all trees become. That's bad. We've talked about monoculture before. But the idea that you could be planting these as row crops and they become a certain type of carbon sink, or one of the types of carbon sink that we would be using in this matrices of different technologies for carbon mitigation, but also that it's being grown with the expectation that the standard method for processing this wood from its tree form to its paper pulp form already requires chemical inputs that we pretty much ignore when we use paper as a product. We don't really think about that being a critical element of that cardboard box that your Amazon stuff came in today. But
Hmm.
it turns out it is. And so by reducing those inputs, then it changes the impact that making paper and carton has on our environment. And that's one of the nice things about this story. There probably is going to be debates about whether or not genetically modified wood is bad in some other way, but the reality is if it's already a plant crop that we're growing, it's already not a natural thing anymore. We already totally change plant crops that we grow for our purposes by crossbreeding them with other things or by selective breeding or any number of different
Absolutely.
ways. That's what a GMO, that's the basic idea of what a GMO is. The newfangled sciencey thing that's a GMO is where we cross a plant genome with like a fungal genome or something like that, or we add in these other elements of genes to
Yeah.
that would never naturally come into
Yeah,
contact.
we're trying to have like yeah, or we'll when we're experimenting with brain tissue from sheep and letting it grow
Hmm.
eyes or something like that, these fun little extra sci-fi projects. So a couple things I
Hmm.
would say about that
Yeah.
is one, if they can reduce the amount of what is it called, uh,
Yep.
lignin, then there might be this might just be the first step in them experimenting with different levels of lignin. They might be able to increase it as well. One might guess. Usually, material science is if you figure out how to reduce something, you could also figure out how to increase it, and therefore possibly increase the structural integrity in the poplar tree to use it for other purposes. Another thought I had is like maybe the Brits are using poplars for something else than we are. Maybe they're like, and it could, sometimes it's funny when we find out, wait, this country's using that crop for that. Oh, okay. They're using soy for this. We're using soy for that. We're using corn for this. They're using corn for that. So it could be potentially maybe the poplar is being used for some other maybe poplar furniture is really in and they like wobbly bendy furniture or something like that. But um,
Well, down in the article a little ways it says compressed wood performed just as well chemically. This compressed wood performed just as well as chemically treated wood, being more than 1.5 times stronger than untreated wood.
hmm,
And this being as strong as, you ready for this pronunciation? Aluminium.
aluminium, the way the Brits say it. Got it.
The alloy 6061, a material commonly used in various engineering and construction applications. So what they're saying is, hey, we pulled out the lignin, we processed this wood using our chemical and compression processes, and now we're getting a piece of wood that's as strong as the aluminum that I buy for our students at campus that they machine on our machine tools.
That's awesome.
So this is an interesting possible. This has interesting implications for possible construction applications. It'll never replace Douglas fir the way that we use wood for construction.
Hmm.
It could make stronger furniture members. I would think that if you're compressing poplar into your IKEA furniture, it'll still weigh as much as lead does for the same size of wood, but it'll be stronger.
Classic IKEA furniture, then. Weirdly heavy and light at the same time. Awkwardly heavy and awkwardly light. Structurally light, typically. Breaks easy,
Yep.
feels heavy, though. That's how I
Asse-
would
uh,
describe
yeah,
IKEA furniture.
totally. Assemble it once and throw it away afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, so that's my good news story. We're seeing advancements in the science of wood engineering, which means that translates into effects on carbon, effects on chemical processing, and possibly effects on the end product performance characteristics for the consumer.
I love a good material science news story. Always makes me excited. And for me, just another iteration of science trying to progress in general. Material science
Mm-hmm.
is really going through a lot of different really cool revolutions, as we've talked before about concrete and various other things. I think didn't we mention the uh, mushroom furniture, the mycelia furniture yet? The space furniture. Did we ever talk about that yet?
Not in this forum and not specifically, but yeah, stay tuned, folks. Get your get out your Paul Stamets totem and get ready for all kinds of things being made from mycelial materials.
Yes. He doesn't have much to directly do with this one, even though he is the avatar for all mushroom science, I
Yeah.
would say. Um, this has more to do with like a discovery by the Russians on their space station about a while
Hmm.
ago, and them thinking it was like an
Hmm.
alien life form and realizing it was like
Yeah.
mushrooms live and actually feed off of radiation from the sun directly, all the really harmful uh, um, microwave radiation that is permeating the cosmos. What we have to protect ourselves from, and what the ozone layer protects us from, and other various our electromagnetic uh, barrier around our Earth is kind of protecting us from this stuff. Mushrooms eat that, so they love that radiation apparently. So,
Speaking of engineered wood products, there is a type of exterior wood that's used for decking. Like if you put a big patio on your outside of your house so that you can have your friends over and grill, it's called Trex. And Trex decking is comprised of recycled plastics. It's some post-consumer waste, recycled plastic content, and then some virgin material and a little bit of wood fiber thrown in for good measure. And then they extrude it like you would extrude your sausage into a casing. And there you go. You've got a board, and you can have it 24 feet long if you want it.
I've decked with
Uh,
that stuff before. I had to learn a lot of lessons about thermal expansion when I was laying that. This was about 20 years ago though, so this was like the first
yeah,
iterations of this when it started to hit the commercial area. It was super expensive
yeah.
at the time, and yeah, back when I was laying decks for a couple summers for a rich doctor, he had a 1,400 square foot deck made of that stuff in the summer.
That's as that's as big as some people's houses.
Yeah.
So that Trex decking, because of its hydrocarbon content, it turns out it is a delicious treat for certain types of hydrocarbon hungry mushrooms.
Oh my god.
So it's not immune to rot. It's not immune to degradation by the elements.
Oh my god.
So you're not getting a 100-year deck out of that. You're getting whatever the mushrooms until they find it and go ham on it. Yeah, there
Oh my
turns out.
god. Better hope you're not having a bunch of wild animals crap around your deck then, because that will be poop in the wild is
Hmm.
feeding fertile ground for mushrooms. So, yeah.
Hmm.
Anyways, well, I guess that's a perfect time to segue into, I guess, our recap of what we talked about last week, which I think we ended with getting into what was happening in Russia during World War One, and there are a couple of revolutions that happened in the first 20 years of the 1900s kicking off for them. What we talked about Kaiser Wilhelm and
Hmm.
his hunger and thirst for war, leading to basically them becoming a militant. Became a militant country while that war happened, because at some point when the Germans started to lose their country, like the parliament or whatever the structural government existed, they wanted an armistice and they wanted a peace, to negotiate a peace. And the generals, the German generals, turned it down, and then essentially said, "Okay, the government is null and void. We are now a martial country once again." Um, so things were not looking good. What other parts of the recap am I missing?
Well, we had a lively discussion about the shapes of different types of empires.
That's right.
Do you remember? Do you remember the definitions of those empires that
Yes,
you're
so
using?
we had the Continental Empire, the one where it was about
Yeah.
gathering land mass, and you
Hmm.
were the worth of your country, your empire was how much land you could
Hmm.
amass, and as you lost your empire, that was signified by you losing that land mass as well, and
Right.
why that created the structures and why it kind of created the system for globalization, why that kind of had to go away as globalization kind of increased.
Yep.
So
And what was the other type of empire?
I forgot. You're going to have to remind me.
Naval empire.
Naval empire. Yes.
There you go.
Yes, that's
So
the one.
the Continental Empire has a pie that can never get any larger. It's a shrinking quantity of resources. And a naval empire operates off of the paradigm that the pie can always grow bigger because we can always have an IPO, sell shares in our enterprise, build a bigger ship, take it farther abroad, buy more stuff, and bring it back to our ports, and circumvent this whole land route for the Silk Road.
Yeah, empires built off
So,
of trade more than land mass per se.
yep.
Although land mass helped with the trade as well, which that the naval empires were about gathering land, but it was more about
Hmm.
gathering land, which would enable more trade. So it
Hmm.
wasn't land for the sake of land anymore. It was land for the sake of trade, and then of course the local resources if it could be gathered. So
Totally. And last week we addressed the fuse and powder keg that World War One started from. We talked about Archduke Franz Ferdinand,
hmm
the assassination of the Archduke and his wife Sophie, the character who perpetrated that assassination, Gabriela Princip,
hmm
and the immediate and converging factors of all of these alliances that were present. Now, my next question for you is so just like World War II, World War One had two major alliances. I'm holding my hands apart that were
hmm
belligerents. Do you remember the names of the two different alliances?
So there was the Central Alliance, which
Yep.
was signified by the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and then later the Ottomans. What they got in right as they thought Germany was going to win, and then Germany started to lose. um, and then the
Don't forget
Allies.
about the Romanians. They were
Yeah,
the Romanians were part of the Central Powers too,
that's right.
and
The
and
Romanians.
and you described the other power the opposite the opposing side the opposing belligerents as the Allies. In World War One, they were called the Entente powers.
The Entente. Yeah.
So what the Entente powers were France and Britain. And what the Entente was nothing to do with World War One specifically. It was essentially a loose handshake agreement between the countries not to go to war with each other over like where their different colonies were fishing.
Okay.
They essentially said, "Hey, listen, we've divided up the world together. That's been a lot of fun for us.
hmm
All right, so you've got colonies here and people doing things over here and here. We're just not going to we're if you say that we're stepping on your land, we'll go ahead and we'll back off. That's what our handshake is going to be. The
hmm
Entente powers were sometimes described as being like or the Entente they were cordially agreeing not to antagonize one another as they had been for centuries before.
Yes.
Britain and
Yes.
France had always been adversaries and competitors. Well, now with the Entente, they were no longer going to be adversarial nor specifically competing with each other. They were going to work within the spheres of influence that they had brought around the planet.
Yeah.
So when the Central Powers, when all the little pieces of history in the Central Powers snapped together like magnets, and they hardened for a military competition, the Entente powers, Britain and France, essentially leveraged what was a handshake over rights of places where their colonies were fishing, now leverage that into a war footing alliance.
Thank God for the
And
French.
because,
They had that handshake agreement with the Brits. We'll just say that. Thank. I mean, like, because at the time, when with this war kicking off, you want the foremost naval power to be on your side when this war kicks
Yep,
off, especially
totally.
geographically based on where the war was kicking off.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anyways, continue.
All right. So what's interesting about all these alliances is, as you said, the Central Powers included the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now pretty wounded because of their heir having been assassinated in the Balkans.
Well, the uncle
The
didn't mind that he died. They didn't like each other, and so when the heir died, it was kind of like, oh no, but like, yeah,
but it was a pretty good reason to go to war with Serbia.
But yes, absolutely a great reason to go into Serbia for sure. Which is what he did
Because
like about it. It was like a means to an end. Like, oh no, he died. Let's go to war. So
Romania and the Ottoman Empire were also included in the Central Powers,
yes,
and that that meant that you had this really interesting organization of different land empires that were going to go toe to toe with France. But oh no, France has a relationship with Tsar Nicholas and the Russians.
hmm
So immediately the Central Powers find themselves in a pinch.
pinch.
So you have Russians. There you go. You have Russians to the east. You have um, French and British on the west. And because one domino fell, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, then all these interlocking alliances between these different nations that were on either side of each other, that was the so that domino hits another bigger domino, which hits another bigger domino, and
Well,
by August, by August, the Schlieffen Plan went into effect.
yeah.
And the Schlieffen Plan, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it because we could play 20 questions all day. Pierce, what's the Schlieffen Plan?
I mean, I guess you could call it the proto blitzkrieg into it was supposed to be such a fast attack into Belgium that they would plow through Belgium and just take
Yes.
France unaware. Like just boom,
Yep.
take it. And they would do it so fast that they would be able to defeat Belgium and France. I mean, Belgium, they weren't even, they were just like, we'll just cross through it. They thought
Yeah.
they were really cocky at the time. We'll cross
Yep.
through. We'll defeat France in like a month or something like that. I don't know. It was the most unrealistic expectation ever. And then we'll turn and whoop that Russian ass. They were like, that was the Schlieffen Plan. And obviously that fell apart right off the bat. I mean, they like were halfway into Belgium before like they ran into the French, and then the UK was immediately like war, like we're in now. So it was really quick, and Russia immediately, the second the German army was like crossing the border to Belgium, the Russian army was like coming in through the northeast. If I'm almost like within a week or something like that, it was very quick.
They were they had a general mobilization the minute the news of the death of the Archduke Ferdinand was out. They mobilized immediately.
Yeah. They were ready. They were waiting for the war to kick off. I mean, the
Yep.
Germans kind of were too. The Russians and the Germans were the most prepared for war against each
Mhm.
other. They wanted to fight.
Mhm.
The Germans
Mhm.
were ready to fight, and it was clear that the
Mhm.
Russians were looking for a reason to fight as well, because they were the most ready. Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. So, um, yeah, they were ready to invade
So
within 3 months of that assassination, or what? 2 months? It was June, or when?
yes. So Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated at the very end of June.
The end of June.
The month of July transpires with all kinds of scrambling in the foreign consulates, and everybody's, you know,
Mm-hmm.
things are changing quickly, and the way that messages are transferred between these powers and these alliances is snail mail at best. It's hand carried. I think that we have telegraph
There's
for sure, and I'm
telegraphs. Yeah.
forgetting it. I don't think we have radio transmission the way that we would later in the 1920s.
I don't
But
remember.
we have all this going on over the month of July, and as I said, the Schlieffen Plan goes And so I'm forgetting the author's name right now. It'll come to me. But if our listeners want to look up the Guns of August, um, the author just does this. All right, here we go, step by step. Here's how it went down, and then just describes everything that we've kind of glossed over really quickly here,
Mm-hmm.
and gets you right up to the doorstep of when we have German commanders banging on the doors of Belgian forts.
Yeah.
So now that we've laid this out, this is 1914. 1914 sees this immediate spark catch into a wildfire, and we have the beginning of um, the war as we know it as World War One. So we're off to the races there, and the first cavalry charges against machine gun emplacements. The first ditches are being dug to handle the problem of the machine gun emplacements and artillery. We've got all these new weapons coming to bear, and now the tone of the war is set. So just about anything we talk about from here until 1918 with regard to the Western Front is going to be, it's the same thing today as it was the other day. And what we're doing is describing battles that have seven-figure casualties.
Yeah. So
And
I wanted to also add to the context. So while this is happening, you have to understand that most of the European powers have amassed massive colonies all over Africa
Mhm,
and Asia.
mhm,
India is a colony by the Brits, right? So when we're talking World War, these colonies, there's battles happening in Africa. In fact, the
mhm.
Germans, as usual, are kicking ass in Africa. Both wars, they do this. Different generals, very famous for their ability. In fact, after World War One ended, the only German general down there didn't even have to surrender. Like he had held basically Africa until they were like, hey, you got to surrender now. And he was like, all right, fine, But so just as context, this was really a world war. Like many of the
Yeah.
colonies were going to war. There were Indian conscripts that were being pulled down to fight in Russia, with the
Mhm,
Russian army and stuff. So
mhm.
yes, and the casualties were mass. The technological gains. This was really the first industrial war too, where we saw
Yes.
industrialization became the power, and the disregard for human life was immense. No longer was it about necessarily just manpower. I mean, they were just cannon fodder for the industrialization of a war. Um, and this was quite the industrialization. We saw iterations of different technologies come out from both sides of the army.
Mhm.
Specifically, the Germans are just have a reputation for being innovative within war, and they did not they did not play around when it came to uh, their ability to think about the problems that they specifically faced and think about ways around them. I mean, the submarine was a perfect example of that, where you had the French and British Navy together was a blockade unlike anything else. I mean, they're the two strongest navies in the world, teamed up at the
Mhm.
time to basically block Germany off from leaving either side of where it would want to go. And
Yep.
then suddenly you start seeing British ships go down like hotcakes, and it's like, oh crap, the U-boat is out in force, and they found a way to bypass these blockades. They found a way to go under, go around these naval ships and sink them and stuff. And that was just one of the innovations. We had tanks, we had steel helmets in general, like that were metal that were supposed to block against shrapnel. We had gas, the first use of chemical warfare, and then therefore anti-chemical warfare. So anyways, that's kind of the context of like just a real quick summary, because I think a lot of people have some idea of World War One, so we don't need to necessarily go through all of the long
Right.
arduous details, but that's kind of my little quick some contextual add to this.
One of the science fun facts about World War One is that the same chemical scientists are so the same chemical scientists that created the process for fixing nitrogen for fertilizer are also the same chemical scientists who developed these heinous chemical weapons that were used in World War One. So if you
And
want to
in
look up
World War
the
Two for other things
yep,
as well, that we're
if you want to
all
look up the Haber
privy to.
Haber process or the Haber Bosch process, The Haber-Bosch process is this nitrogen fixing technology for so one of the through lines to our conversations is I operate off of a thesis that in the 20th century, human beings, for all the strife and conflict in the 20th century, solved many of the most um, needling problems of our survival and thriving. We really engineered out some of the leading causes of our short lifespans and child mortality rates. And definitely, if you look at a uh, population plot starting in 1900 and going until 2000, you'll see this incredible what's called a exponential curve taking place. And what that it's a product of are these innovations like the Haber-Bosch process, where we went from being able to farm premium ground and had to really kind of baby it, and maybe we could get some fertilizer into it from bird guano. I know that's redundant to say bird guano, but it's bird crap as fertilizer. And from that to where we could now begin to not only grow crops in marginal cropland, we could grow crops in the tertiary marginal cropland, because this process was so effective at changing the fecundity of soil that we no longer were operating on um, a limit around how much people we could have to that we could actually feed. That these limits went away entirely.
Well, these inventions saved a bunch of famines from happening. At the time,
Yeah.
I believe they were invented because of the famines and how many people
Mm-hmm.
died of starvation
Mm-hmm.
every couple of years when the seasons were just poor, of course. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, this is absolutely, I mean, the poetic story, it's a sad poetic story because it's a story of saving Europe and then leading to the demise. I mean, I believe one of these professors was Jewish, and so I mean this technology was used eventually to gas people in World War II in the chambers in concentration camps. I believe both this guy and his wife killed themselves because of this. Or
Yeah.
it's a
The end
tragedy.
was grim for the end was tragic and grim for the Habers.
Yes.
So anyway, that's your fun fact for the week. If you want to look up the Haber-Bosch process, it's the same person who created this amazing technology. I'm pointing at the Wikipedia page in front of me.
Yeah.
The same
Fertilizer.
technology
Yes.
that created fertilizer and also like mustard gas or
Mustard gas.
whatever
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah, which killed, yeah, they were using
Ugh.
chemical warfare. And the Germans were the one, I mean, the Germans, like, every time that the Entente uh, partnership thought that they had Germany contained or the contained, suddenly Germany was coming out with U-boats and they were bypassing the naval blockade. And then when the Brits got involved and started to push back in through Belgium into towards Germany, well, suddenly chemical warfare. All of a sudden, Germany came out with their mustard gas and stopped the Brits right in their tracks. And
Yep.
the Germans were just so far ahead of just coming up with ways to kind of bypass the situations that the new tech was going. They were very dynamic as far as a wartime industry and economy. The Brits, I do believe, get credit for the first tanks that we saw on the
Mm-hmm.
battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
So the Brits were also pretty innovative at the time when it came to warfare. And within this timeline, we did see planes on the battlefield towards the end of the battlefield as well as the Hindenburg. It should be noted that Hindenburg, although we know him for the dirigibles that went down because they were full of hydrogen, um, he was a badass wartime general. There's a reason why that device was named after him. He was
Mm-hmm.
kicking ass and taking names. In fact, he was known for when the Russians first invaded northeastern Germany. Uh, he was sent up there with another famous general, which I'm forgetting his name because he didn't have a dirigible named after him. So he wasn't as good as the other one, I guess. But our history just favored Hindenburg. But these guys came back and pushed the Russians right back out. And like Russians, the whole time World War I was happening, I it seemed as though the Russians experienced many, many, many humiliating defeats, and that they just seemed to have so many people to throw at this war, which was really why they only were able to stay in the game until inevitably those people, uprose because of the blatant disregard for life. I mean, there was this war. After studying it a lot, is super depressing because of it really displayed a blatant disregard for life on pretty much all sides of the war for 3 years at least, until we started to see the effects of all those people dying really start to put strain on each of these countries, because it wasn't just the soldiers dying that were dying so much. I mean, that there was a blatant disregard for their life, but then you had the civilian population, which was dying of famine and starvation and displacement constantly the whole 4 years. I mean,
Right.
it was truly a tragic event where life was it was it was like each army being commanded was being commanded by the Russians, because the Russians have never stopped this strategy of the meat grinder. They're still treating wars like they did back then, unironically.
Mhm.
I mean, I only laugh.
Mhm.
It's absolutely tragic, and I think because me and Richard were in the military for so long, we do have a darker sense of humor and a drier sense of humor when it comes to this stuff. But it was stark. That war, um, we haven't seen anything like that from most modern armies anymore. Even World War II, there was so much more regard for human life comparatively, um, for each person soldiers at life, and by most
Right.
armies they valued the soldier's life a lot more than any of the people did in World War One. The U.S.
So
did have a higher value to their soldiers' life just by their unwillingness for Woodrow Wilson to even get involved in this war. So I will say that we do get a tap, a nod, or a feather in our cap because of that. So
when we convene next time on this topic, because we're not going to finish World War I in any meaningful way in 1 hour long session, I'm going to introduce the audience to the Medal of Honor write up for Alvin York. And you've heard me talk about Alvin York before. It's one of the most incredible and impressive feats of martial history in the United States is what this man performed on the battlefield, and it's a truly redeeming World War I story, if there ever was one.
oh, good.
But I digress. Where you begin to go with your part of the conversation here is exactly, it's precisely chef's kiss. You went right into where we want to go with our conversation in general, which is with regard to the proto or the earliest inklings of a Cold War between East and West, and how that relates to what what put into motion the first baby steps towards what ultimately would become this Cold War between the United States and the USSR. And
and and,
when you talk
and we
about the
will eventually, and I'm sorry, just to add on top of that, and to now the latest iteration of that Cold War, which we are in right
yeah,
now. So I always want to reiterate
absolutely.
this to our viewers or anybody who's new. It
Yeah.
is my one of my theses is that we are leading towards with this globalization talk is the fact and the idea that I think we are still in a Cold War right now, a newer iteration of it,
Hmm.
and that's part of the reason we're getting into this, because we're interested in this subject. I wanted to study it more, and listening to Richard's thesis about Russia's role in World War One specifically, I think it's going to be really interesting for a lot of the viewers, because you're going to see a lot of similarities to Russia right now and U.S. Russia, Stalinist Russia, I should say, um, and then there'll be a small hiatus post-Soviet Russia, which would be like their best shot at democracy that they tried for 10
Yeah.
years maybe, and then we'll get back to that. So anyways, that is all to say, yes, right here.
So we've kind of got ourselves into this nice stage in 1914 where we know who the players are, the Central Powers and the Entente. The Entente includes France kind of at the center because of their alliance with Russia and Great Britain as a key partner to France in the Western Front. And now that we know, and we have the Central Powers players, which are important to note, include Germany. And then what we're going to do is the non-linear storytelling that works pretty good in some cases, but we'll see how well it works here. So our stage is set. The war is on. If we take a little step back in time and go to 1904 and 1905, we'll be able to come back to the Western Front anytime, and we know that the same
Sure.
thing is going on for 4 years. It doesn't
Yes,
change much.
it
The
doesn't.
the the battle lines don't change. The tactics don't change.
I
So
talked about all
in
the
night,
changing technology already. I mentioned it all. That's all
yeah,
the new stuff. If you filter it out over the 4 years, it happened.
mm-hmm,
U-boats, tanks, planes, helmets, gas,
yep,
so on. This happened throughout the
yep,
war. Each party had a play. They invented this stuff. They implemented it, and lots of people died.
mm-hmm.
All right, there we go.
Here we go. Back in
1904, Russia.
1905, yeah, 1904, 1905. So Russia and Japan have a little. We're going to call this the Russo-Japanese War. It's a war. It's a capital W war.
But it's more of an ass
But
whooping.
by comparison to World War One, it looks like a local skirmish. But the
Sure.
Russians get their asses handed to them. The post Meiji Restoration Japan at the beginning of the 20th century is not to be trifled with. This is the empire that we would go to war with in 1942 after their
Also
bombing
not
of
to be
Pearl Harbor
trifled
in
with.
1941.
Yeah. Also
Yes,
not to be trifled
they
with
are
at
not
that point. Like they knew they
right.
shouldn't trifle with us, but they were no easy picnic for us.
this is a rapidly from talk about a warp speed program. This is a country who went from um, what would seem like, if it were not so violent, a laconic, like this, um, agrarian and fiefdom style country
Yep.
to a fully industrialized war machine that was on the path,
With the
the war
innovation
path.
of an island country
Mm-hmm.
too, and not
Mm-hmm.
as many rivals close to it like the UK, but some.
Ja-
Yeah.
Japan is what kind of an empire?
A naval empire. Yeah.
Bingo. So the Russians are pretty hurt by this war they have with Japan. It's demoralizing and it's appalling to them that they would be defeated by an Asiatic people because the Russians pretty sure of their place in the human hierarchy
Something
and
about white superiority or something. Probably felt a little wounded about that when a people's from an island that's like
mm-hmm,
what
mm-hmm.
1/30th the size of your country. I don't know. I don't know how many Japans fit in Russia, but probably a lot. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So this is one of the features of history that gets us to the 1905 revolution, which was not really. It was protests. It was strikes. It was all the things that you could imagine happening in a autocratic civilization, um, a continental empire with an autocrat at the head of it.
Yeah.
But it didn't have a single direction to go in as a philosophical idea or a political concept. There were just people were pissed, and they were pissed for a lot of different reasons. And so you get this Russian Revolution of 1905.
An
Okay.
unsuccessful one, right? Because at the end of the day, it didn't dislodge the czars at all. They didn't have a forward like a collective direction, and it didn't work. Basically, was my gist of it. I kind of read over it, and it was just they had a revolution, and nothing really changed at the end of the day. I guess there were small reforms, or I don't know. Um,
I'll read from biography.com here. In 1904, Russia went to war with Japan. The conflict had a profound impact on Russian society. After a number of defeats put a strain on the country's domestic budget, citizens from all walks of life began to vocalize their discontent. And they called for political structure and reform. Okay, so rail strikes and things like that.
Sure.
The situation was heightened on January 9th, 1905, when a group of unarmed workers in St. Petersburg took their concerns directly to the city's palace to submit a petition to Emperor Nicholas II. They were met by security forces who fired on the group, killing and wounding hundreds.
Ooh.
So this is why it's not a footnote in history. This is why it's one of the turning points in history. The crisis set
Nigeria
the
should be
stage for what
taking
would be
notes
called
right now. I'll just say this right now. Yeah, if you want to know what I'm talking about, Google Nigeria right now, and they should be taking notes about firing onto people who are protesting and putting petitions in. Just saying.
the crisis set the stage for what would be called the Russian Revolution of 1905. So this is January 1905.
Mm-hmm.
The year before, we have this war with the Russo-Japanese War. All right. Here is where we play the fanfare. The horns come out. Toot, 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 toot.
Mm-hmm.
In walks, on our stage, on our global stage, walks the person of Vladimir Lenin. This is a name that just in our Western history, anyone who's heard this name and connects it to the person and the happenings of the early 20th century, it is a inflammatory name, Vladimir Lenin.
Mm-hmm.
So Vladimir Lenin had been on the scene already. He'd been, he'd gone to university. He studied different works and writing on his popular uprisings around labor.
Yep.
He was beginning to look at this scenario of people living in poverty and being subjects of the crown in Russia. He had read Das Kapital, which is Karl Marx's work. And he's in St. Petersburg when this happens. Hoping to placate his citizens, the emperor issued his October manifesto, offering up several political concessions, most notably the creation of an elective legislative assembly known as the Duma. So Tsar Nicholas goes, okay, my bad, sorry about the shootings and so forth and the unpleasantness. How about we do this Duma? You can elect a legislature.
Give them kind of a
Lenin
parliament,
was
their first parliamentary type of system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But Lenin was far from satisfied. His frustrations extended to his fellow Marxists, in particular the group calling itself the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov. There's a lot of names here, they're Russian names, and most American listeners are going to be like, who are you talking about? Just go with me.
Mm-hmm.
The character that we really care about, his arc in history, it's not that the others are unimportant. It's that Lenin is the through line that we want to hang our hat on.
Yeah.
The issue centered around the party structure and the driving forces of a revolution to fully seize control of Russia. A Duma is not going to be Lenin's satisfactory outcome. No. We're going to seize control of the Russian state. We want this autocrat and his family out of here. We're done with this. We're going to modernize Russia into the workers' paradise. You've heard this one before.
Yeah.
And we're not going to settle for this. And so, whereas in 1905, we don't really have a direction for how to take this revolution, but don't you worry. Vladimir Lenin has the recipe.
Yeah. I'm sure he was scheming and then scheming since 1905 when that war kicked off. I bet you those schemes on the back end got schemier and schemier, especially since the czars, what's crazy about Russia is throughout the war, as they failed more and more, the czar started to I'm going to take control of this situation. I guess no one else can do it but me. And moxie for being that clueless or unaware of the situation that you're in when your country is losing all these wars, and you decide as the leader of that country to take more direct responsibility towards military command. I mean, it couldn't have been more of a layup for Lenin at this point, right? To go,
Mhm.
look at he's
Yeah.
responsible for this. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so yeah,
Now
and when I
we're
was catching up on history, this is where I started to see where you were going with this, the start of the Cold War, because I was like, oh, this is why it's happening. I can see it all starting to play out, and then of course the introduction of Lenin. Yeah, and I mean he was a
so
Marxist
Lenin.
since like the 1893. He was like the leader of the Marxist party in you know in the area, right? I mean, a long time.
He's not. He's hipster communist. Like he was
He
communist before communism was cool,
yeah.
right? So he's been exiled. He's come back into the fray. He gets exiled again. Like he's a troublemaker, and he's where the hammer is hitting the iron here in this 1905 massacre in St. Petersburg. So he argued a real and complete revolution, one that would lead the socialist revolution that could spread outside of Russia, must be led by the workers of the country's proletariat. And I love using the word proletariat sometimes when I talk about, people that aren't in government or aren't rich. We're talking about folks that are just folks and they have a living to make and they have the crushing burden of taxes put upon them and so forth. And these people were ready for a change. From the Menshevik's point of view, however, Lenin's ideas really paved the way for a one man dictatorship over the people he claimed to want to empower. It's going to come in later.
Mm,
Foreshadowing.
foreshadowing.
The two groups had sparred since the party's second Congress, which had handed Lenin's group, known as the Bolsheviks, a slim majority. The fighting would continue until 1912 at a party conference in Prague, when Lenin formally split to create a new separate entity. Here we go. During World War I, Lenin went into exile again, this time taking up residence in Switzerland. As always, his mind stayed focused on revolutionary politics. During this period, he wrote and published Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism.
Hmm. Okay. Hmm.
That's published in 1916, a defining work for their future leader, in which he argued that war was the natural result of international capitalism.
So global trade is actually the reason for World War One, not interesting. Interesting. Hmm.
So imperialism is the model for how even so we have continental and naval empires,
Mm-hmm.
and they participate in um, uh, the organization of people and materials. Labor is a commodity. Materials are a commodity. I think that we could make a pretty strong argument that uh, the driving force behind everything that we know of at this point is cotton, sugar, and rubber. Like these are the most important things that move people around the planet as slaves, that set up different versions of
Wait, are we
colonial
in?
plantations.
Yes, and then in the 1900s, where it's coal and oil at
Yep.
that point. Yeah.
Yep. And this the highest stage of capitalism being imperialism. And remember, in Lenin's paradigm, there ain't nothing worse than capitalism. It is the worst thing that ever existed. We're in a total war with capitalism as an ideology and as a economic system. And he absolutely is positioned here to say what we've been doing is unbelievably corrupt and bad, and it hurts the labor force. I wanted to get here
The irony.
today, and we arrived. We arrived at the place I was hoping to land at, because the anecdote about Lenin and how he found his way back into Russia in 1917, pretty interesting. Turns out the Germans helped.
Mm-hmm.
They sealed him up in a car on a train and trucked his butt back up into the Eastern Front and deposited him after I think a trip out to the into the North Sea or whatever the yeah
Yeah.
he did a little boat ride and now he's back at St. Petersburg. He's back in Russia proper, and this is just in time for the second Russian Revolution of the 20th century, which was in 1917.
Hmm.
We're going to convene back on that next time.
Yeah.
But before we go, it's oftentimes a footnote at the bottom of the page that you're reading in your history book about World War One. This is the Christmas ceasefire of 1914. And the reason I want to bring this up before we end our session today, or end our conversation today, session, what are we in? Some kind of, is this a treatment? Before we end our conversation today, I want to talk about the Christmas ceasefire of 1914 on the Western Front. It's a footnote usually because, it didn't change anything in history. The war continued for another 3 years. Let's see, 3.5 years. It
It
was
was like one of the nicest
Armistice
parts of the
days.
war, to be honest. It got worse after
Yeah.
that. Like,
Armistice Day is in November of 1918. So, basically another 3.5 years.
mm-hmm.
And what took place was this Christmas miracle. And on Christmas Day, you had people stand up out of their trenches where they had previously been mowing each other down with machine gun fire and blasting each other to bits with artillery fire. And for just a few hours on Christmas Day, not only was there a truce so that the different sides of the trenches could get up and claim their dead and take them back for repatriation and burial, but they got up and they, you know,
Sang
this one had some
songs.
Turkish delight, this one
Yeah.
had some smokes, this one was a barber, this one had something that resembled a soccer ball. They got together, they sang songs, they exchanged gifts, and it's the most bizarre thing that's so totally out of character for this horrible, horrible war that went on for way too long and cost way too many lives. The Christmas truce, the Christmas ceasefire
Mm-hmm.
was unofficial. It was not up and down the entire Western Front, but it happened in a couple different places. Like it was spontaneous and uncoordinated, and it for just a few short hours, the commanders didn't know what to do. And this is a war where we have generals who are responsible for creating this horrible carnage of this war. And they're not quite sure what to do about it, but they damn sure never let it happen again. And the reason that this is an interesting anecdote to me and not just a footnote in history is because it is the intersection between where Europe could have gone, but in the paroxysms of the dying empires, they could not tolerate the proletariat from getting together, having a smoke, cutting each other's hair, and kicking a soccer ball around and exchanging gifts on this um, this war front, this Western Front, where there's martial activity going on here. We cannot tolerate this because what about glory and honor and duty to country, and what about the king and so forth? So what Vladimir Lenin is saying, and I haven't read Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The title does it all for me. What his central thesis is in all of his work and all of his speeches and all of his machinations in not just Europe but in Russia is that what's going on in the battlefield is exactly what he's against. It's precisely what he's against. You don't get this type of war machine without having capitalist empires to drive it forward, to suck resources out of the East and from Africa, to make it and from the West for sure, where these plantations are. You don't get the fighting ability with all these commodities and manpower if you're not a capitalist. The capitalists are the ones that have caused this, and that whole little That whole little sexy Christmas scene that went on there on the Western Front, that is anathema to the imperial capitalist war machine.
You know,
Because what if those soldiers caused the truce of World War One, and it happened in the days or weeks after Christmas? What if they would have done that? What if they would have been able to overcome the adversarial nature of all these
then
international relationships?
so
Go
it's
ahead.
so funny how um, off Lenin's diagnosis of what was happening and his diagnosis of capital was when what he was actually seeing was the last vestiges of imperialism, and that was around for the last 50, I mean, from that 1900s to 1950, you had the last vestiges of imperialism. So he was mischaracterizing capitalism as imperialism. And in fact, capitalism has proven to be the most peaceful system in that we've ever invented in our world, period, to this day. Because it turns out that global trade actually cuts down on global fighting, because if everyone's connected through trade and agreements, then it's not in your best interest to fight other people. So it's crazy to me. I mean, it's funny, if he wanted that to happen, then he might have well just rewritten Russia to becoming a capitalist country over time,
Yeah.
instead of it becoming the communist country, which is a gaslighting type of this gaslighting of what freedom is, while
Mm-hmm.
obviously setting the country up for an authoritarian dictatorship, with which they have right now. Um, so it is a little fun. That would be a fun novel for someone to write if the Russians had popped out of the war before they had a revolution and communism had never taken over. There's a good chance they could be a capitalist country by now. I mean, because the UK and France were already well on their way there. They were becoming less and less imperial and more parliamentary
Mm-hmm.
over the decade, those decades specifically. And you had the rise of the U.S. After World War One. The U.S. still wasn't quite a player globally until World War II, because we were dealing with a lot of internal strife and issues at the time between that period of time. Um, so yeah, it would be a fun idea to see what history, how it would have played out had Lenin gotten what he wanted. I don't think he would have necessarily been so happy, but he seemed like a tour de force. He might have been able to overthrow the czar regardless of how history had gone either way, because that it looked as though the people were ready for a change regardless. It's too bad that they chose that one. Um, but we'll talk about that more in the future. I do like us focusing on the Russia element for this. I think it's the part I don't know much about as far as World War I goes, and since they're so relevant today now, I think they're one of the more interesting parts for us to focus on. So yeah, with that, I think this is a good time to call it good. We're at an hour and 8 minutes. So, Richard, it's been very enjoyable talking to you about globalization once again for part three, and I'm looking forward to part four next time.
Right on, Pierce. This is one of my favorite topics. I could go on and on and on. So I hope the audience is enjoying this to the extent that we can make it tractable and interesting. And it's been a pleasure talking with you too.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
All right. See you later, dude.